Welcome to Students of Aging, the podcast that honors the incredible journeys and stories of seniors growing older. Tune in and become a part of our community as we redefine what it means to age gracefully and purposefully.
I'd like to be remembered as someone who helped move the needle towards being a less death-denying society.
Hello, my name is Jania Zapotowski, and I'm a member of the Seniors Advisory Council for WoodGreen Community Services. Our members are creating and producing Students of Aging podcasts, which is funded by the Government of Canada. It addresses issues pertaining to older adults. Today, our topic is the Death Cafe. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Linda Hochstetler, who is a registered social worker in a very busy private practice. Linda is an expert on dying and death issues and the author of 21 Days to Die, which is a Canadian guide to end of life. She also conducts the Death Cafe meetings in Toronto. Welcome, Linda. It's a pleasure to see you here today.
Thanks, Janya. I'm happy to be here.
What is the Death Cafe?
Well, I like to start by saying the Death Cafe is a global movement. It is not mine. I did not create it. It's truly a global movement that is known around the world. And the Death Cafe movement is one that was begun in 2011 by a man by the name of John Underwood in England. And he really believed that we have a death-denying society. And he wanted us to be able to talk freely about anything related to dying and death and to not have any kind of limits, nobody selling anything, nobody trying to make us think about anything in particular, but just an open place for us to get used to talking about dying and death.
How did you become involved with the Death Cafe?
In 2014, I was laid off from a job and decided kind of overnight that I wanted to start working with dying and death. It's kind of a strange thought, maybe. It's not your average thought when you get laid off from one job. But I knew overnight that it was time. Something, I sort of had a niggle in my own mind and was ready to begin shifting gears. I'd always been a social worker doing a lot of grief counseling, but I decided at that point that I actually wanted to go into not just the grief part, but the further up the stream and to talk about death. And I couldn't find much out there about death. No one wanted to teach me about death. Definitely didn't want to teach me about dying. And then I found the Death Cafe movement. And what I learned was there is a place where people are talking about death. So I went to a death cafe, found one in Georgetown. That was the closest I could find at the time. This is back in 2014. And so on a snowy winter's day, I drove out to Georgetown and attended my first death cafe. And I knew immediately I had found my people. So then I thought, well, what else is there to do but start my own? So I came back and decided it was time to see if there was interest in Toronto, and I signed up to run my very first Death Cafe in the beginning of 2015, and the rest is history. Here I am, 9 years later, still running Death Cafes.
So what are some of the reasons people attend Death Cafes?
They attend for a variety of reasons, but something brings their lives towards death. And they're not comfortable with the resources that they're kind of given. So sometimes it's people who have had a recent death, maybe a loved one, a family, friends, and they find no one wants to talk about it. And they're part of a family or setting where they're left kind of in their own conversations. And they're not necessarily wanting grief counseling. They're not necessarily, so upset that they're missing work and feeling like they need to talk about it from that setting, but they want to simply talk about the death. We also have a lot of people who come to death cafes because they're pondering some of the deeper questions, the existential ones, like where do we go when we die? What happens? What happens in the dying process? Can we even see it coming? Can we plan for it? Like, if we wanted to plan for it, where would we go? And so sometimes people come looking for resources. wanting to know what's out there to help. People knowing they don't know, that they don't know anything about dying and death, and they don't even know where to start. When you want to learn to paint, you got to have a teacher that's going to teach you, and you take painting lessons and you become a painter. But you want to know about dying, and where do you go? Like, it's really kind of unknown. So some people come to the Death Cafe and start asking around, going, who can teach me a little bit about the dying process? What kind of resources are there? If I want to die at home, am I allowed to? If my loved one dies and I want to keep them at home, am I allowed to? And so often what happens is there are questions that are asked of the various people in the room. And we have a lot of really interesting people that show up in these rooms. And a lot of them know all different parts about the dying process, either because they personally have had experiences. They've had someone die and somehow they knew about something. Maybe a death doula came and showed them how to wash a body, and so then they can speak to that. Or maybe a loved one died in a residential hospice and it was an amazing experience, and they can speak to that. So whether it's from personal experience or whether it's from a professional who has decided to work in the field and is kind of curious to meet others who are like them and want to talk about death, not just occasionally, but all the time. And so there are also a lot of people that attend these death cafes that somehow work in the death field, because it's pretty broad. There's a really wide range of people working in death these days. And so you can go home from one of these death cafes and you have always learned something, something new.
I remember bringing this topic up at one of our council meetings years ago, and it went down like a lead balloon because I suggested it, and this time when I brought it up, people were really keen. And I'm hearing you say that people bring information with them as well, rather than just looking for answers. So maybe you could talk about how the movement has grown.
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit more how it began, because I realized I didn't go very far into the beginning, and from there I can tell you how it's grown. But it began in 2011, and at that point it was in England, and it was very much the vision of John Underwood to imagine that people would meet in public places, and these public places in England were generally cafes where someone would go to have a cup of tea, and that was the British version. And John really believed that we needed to branch out from there. And so by the time I got involved a couple of years later, 3 years later, he had a mission. He had a mission to spread it around the world, because he really believed that we did not talk about death well anywhere in the world. So he was spreading it. There is a beautiful deathcafe.com website. You can go on this website and find out about other death cafes. And the movement began to grow. And it was beautiful because it began to change depending on where the conversations were. There are some strict rules. John Underwood really wanted to maintain the integrity of that which is called a death cafe. So there are many very interesting death education projects out there that are wonderful and amazing, but they are not death cafes. So a death cafe has a couple of very strict guidelines. Number one, you may not sell anything. There cannot be a particular focus. You cannot make money on these. These are not money-making ventures in any kind of way. The death cafe must not have a position. You cannot say, well, everyone who comes must approve of medical assistance in dying. We're going to talk about that, and you have to like that idea. Inherently, if you're going to call it a death cafe, you cannot have any kind of prescribed ideas of what kind of conversation is going to happen. You can't have a topic. It is not scripted. It must be unique at each and every death cafe. This is the beauty and the wisdom of the death cafe movement as John created it. And so if those are the things it's not, what is it? Well, it must always be free. Or, you can take donations if you have costs. So sometimes there are room rentals, depending on where you go. Occasionally there are like practical actual costs. But that's it in terms of the money that could be generated for a Deaf Cafe. So there's kind of two flavors, two variations of Deaf Cafes. One is when a Deaf Cafe is one large group. And so sometimes that's helpful depending on how big. You can handle a large group Deaf Cafe of about 10 or 12, particularly if there's a group that already meets regularly to talk about various aging issues. But it's hard to get engaged. And be clear, John Underwood wanted us to be engaged. The whole point of a Deaf Cafe is to speak and listen, but it's to give people the opportunity to speak about dying and death. So you can have these large group Deaf Cafes if you have a relatively small large group, if that makes sense. But what is more common often, and the ones I prefer, are to have people sitting in small clusters of 4 to 6 people in a group. Space between, because the room gets kind of noisy, depending on where you're meeting. And so in general, these small groups of 4 to 6 people sitting at a table is the preferred method. How I like to do it is we start with one arrangement, and then after an hour, we upset the fruit basket, everybody switches, you pick a new group, a new table, and you have another brand new conversation. And it's just a way to get double the benefit in some ways. You have double the flavor, double the variety in terms of the kind of people who are in the room and the kind of people you might actually connect with. And so people are talking then in these small groups, and essentially you can't give them topics. If you're giving topics, you're actually not doing a Deaf Cafe.
Right.
It's kind of counterintuitive, and I find many new Deaf Cafe leaders are often a little wary about it, going like, what if everybody just sits there and says nothing?
So you're saying they're conversations.
They are conversations, and I promise you, people always talk. They always talk at Deaf Cafes. And so all I do is I get people in their small tables, kind of make sure everybody's comfortable. We like to have snacks, so there's like some tea and coffee. I've done this for many years at a local bar called Say What, and we stayed there for a number of years. And then they switched owners. We got too big for this bar. We had too many people. The wait lists were a little bit crazy to kind of accommodate, and we decided to switch to a different venue, and we connected with the Toronto Public Library. I should say, they connected with me.
Right.
They found me and said, hey, this is a great idea. Would you use our space? We'll give it to you for free. We'll provide the snacks. And I said, beautiful. They also wanted me to lead all around the city. And I'm like, yeah, I don't have quite that much time. But our team of other Deaf Cafeers stepped up. And so it's essentially the Toronto West Deaf Cafe that is now spread throughout the city of Toronto. And there could be no better place, nothing more Canadian than meeting for free in the Toronto Public Library system.
Exactly.
It's a beautiful combination. And so they host them, they promote them, and we use their space gratefully.
In your experience, are certain cultures more open to talking about death than others?
It really varies. I mean, it is true that there's some cultures that have different holidays and ceremonies. The Mexican Day of the Dead comes to mind for many people. I think it's November 1st, if I remember. And it's a day when there's honoring of ancestors. We know that indigenous cultures around the world really respect ancestral visits and stories. And so they have a little bit more openness towards the death and the dying process. I'm a student of Vajrayana Buddhism, and in Vajrayana Buddhism and Buddhism in general, there are a lot of death practices where one remembers death on a daily basis. One imagines their own dying process, and there's actually prayers one says for people after they've died. So there's a number of different cultures that do encourage some of these practices, but certainly in my experience, regardless whether they have those individual practices, no culture really does it well. I have to say, we all have a lot to learn about embracing death into life. And I wish I could say that somebody has got it right, but I think we all have kind of bought up the medicalization of death and stepped away with the naturalness of it. So anything that brings us into more the naturalness of death is good for us, no matter what our culture.
What about the demographic of the attendees, such as the age or ratio of men to women?
It's actually very different every single group. Like there are some groups where it's mostly women and just a couple of men, and I'm like, wow. And then the next one will have mostly men. And we have young and we have old. One of my early groups had a lot of people from the Humber College funeral program. So we had all these 18-year-olds coming into the death cafes, and they stuck around for a number of years, and now they seem to have moved on. Maybe they're graduated, I'm not sure. And we have people of middle age, and we do have a fair number of people that are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s that also show up. But I think people are often surprised that they don't make up the majority. That we have a lot more people that I would say are generally kind of middle age. Got to be careful with that phrase these days, but people who are certainly younger rather than the younger. I should say the majority are probably in the middle third, not younger or older, but it's always a range. And it's a range of genders, it's a range of ages. It is truly a variety of people. It's a slice of life, because as we all know, everyone dies.
All ages, all cultures. So if we were sitting at a meeting, what kinds of conversations might we overhear?
Wow, that's a great question. And certainly it varies at every table, and every single death cafe is different. But the one directive that I say to encourage and crack open the conversation from the get-go is to tell stories and to ask questions. So it is extremely common for people to tell death stories, or even more, dying stories, because the dying process is so uncommon. It's something that we have like very little experience with. And what often happens is we talk about the extreme stories. We talk about the really good ones that are so amazing and they're so sweet, and we just want to say over and over, that was a good death. They died, but it was such a good death. And so people come and they want to talk about these good stories and say, I want to make sure I can do this when I'm going to die. And there's gratitude for being able to tell a good story about a good death and how much better it was than they thought it would be. No fear. Or people come telling bad stories. We also hold the bad stories, stories where there was much grief and suffering, stories where people lived on way longer than they wanted to live, and how difficult it was to decide when the life was done and to make decisions about ending it with feeding tubes and breathing tubes. And so we hear a lot of stories, both the good and the bad. That's what I would say. We also hear a lot of questions, people pondering things. And we encourage respect and different views in all death cafes. And what happens then is people are free to really pose a question and ponder it and say, here's kind of what I was thinking. This is kind of my view. What do you think? And to kind of go around in the group and get other views of what people think, and where'd you learn that? Where'd you get that idea? And to be able to explore it openly in a way that doesn't often happen either in the religious group. Maybe people don't have a religious group anymore. Maybe people's families don't want to spend time, with those deeper questions. So we end up talking about any of these stories and questions that have to do with dying and death. And what I also like to tell people is there's a fear that when you go to a death cafe, they're going to be very somber and they're going to be quiet and you're going to leave feeling really depressed. And instead, people come to these death cafes and there is way more laughter than there are tears. And people come away feeling this was the most important meeting I've attended in years. And the deep pondering of these life questions feels so much more important than watching the baseball game down the street or having, you know, another glass of wine and a Netflix movie. And there's something about the depth of it that really resonates for others looking for some of those deep experiences.
The last meeting that I attended,
Yes.
you set up a suicide table, which I believe is the first time you
Yes.
did that. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so that was actually at the invitation or the request of an attendee. So a woman who has attended before contacted me before the Death Cafe, and she said, I really need this. I really need to come. And my nephew just suicided. And I don't want to freak people out. I don't want to like talk to people who don't want to talk about suicide, but I need to talk about suicide, and I don't know where else to go. I think we could actually talk about it at the Death Cafe. What do you think, Linda? And I said, yeah. So here's what we'll do. So in truth, suicide comes up often at death cafes, as you can imagine. It's a form of death. But to be able to give this person the support and the space she needed, I thought it might be interesting to see what would happen if we set up a table with a sign that said, this is the suicide table. Come here if you choose. And again, it was optional. And anyone who came to that table knew that there would be talk about suicide, and they would be open to that. And so we had it filled, and more than a table wanted to talk. And so we agreed that it would be, you know, one group the first half, and then when we switched up, that everybody who was in the first half would leave, and that a new group could take that table. And so we ended up with having 2 different groups that was there. And the feedback I received was it was heartfelt to this particular person who really needed it.
Yeah.
And they were so touched by others' interest. And I can't say enough about how important it is to be interested in dying and death. Mm-hmm. and to be able to talk about dying and death with people who aren't going to shut it down, that are going to sit there with you.
Absolutely.
To not rush the conversation, but give you the space to talk, listen, and then speak when you want. Like to be able to go back and forth and to just hold the openness around death that death really deserves.
As I said, I sat at that table.
Yeah.
And it was more than interesting.
Yeah.
And I felt at the end of, an hour or so, I was overwhelmed.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have missed it because we also talked about MAID.
Yes, medical assistance in dying also came up. Yeah. Yeah, it's like anything. Death is exhausting. It takes us to places that we don't normally go. And it takes an enormous amount of emotional energy to be with dying and death. So it's like anything. You don't want to do death cafes 24/7.
No.
I've tried to figure out how often to hold them. I've landed on 3 or 4 times a year.
Right.
I find to do it more often is a bit overwhelming, and one gets the best use out of a death cafe if one kind of dips into it and then dips out. And I would say the same thing with suicide. Suicide may be too heavy for 2 hours for a double session.
Exactly.
So I think it's a good idea. I'd like to do suicide tables regularly. Maybe also have a MAID table, I'm not sure. But to have a suicide table that limits it so that you're there for 1 hour and then you get a break and you get to leave and you go talk about death in a different kind of way.
Right. So what keeps you involved in the Death Cafe?
I keep doing them because we're not yet done. The work is not yet done. We are still a denying society. And until society stops denying death and makes it easy to talk about death in all settings, I'm not going to stop. So this is my life passion. We all have different passions in life. Mine shows up as interest in dying and death. And whether I'm at a cocktail party with friends or whether I'm sitting with clients individually, one-on-one in my therapy sessions. This is my passion, this is my voice, this is my lifetime. You know, I mentioned that John Underwood set this up back in 2011, but he actually only lived to the age of 44. And he died suddenly at the age of 44. And I think he knew that death is important. And it was his passion as well. And so it's on behalf of him and all the rest of us in society that know that we can do things better. We can help people talk about dying and death. You may wonder why I call it dying and death, because I think we have a tendency to speak about death and dying as if that's the sequence. That's not the sequence. You don't have death first. Why do we say that? But it's as if we don't want to land on death. We don't want to say death last because that leaves it kind of hanging in the air. So we try to say death and dying, because then we can kind of quickly run past it. But it doesn't make sense, it's not logical, and so I'm encouraging us to actually switch the English language and to actually talk about dying and death and give them both their equal. And certainly at death cafes, we try to let people talk about the dying process, which is a whole different thing from the death process. And so it's two very important components. We call this a death cafe, but be clear, in many cases, the death part's the easy part. There's a death moment. It's very short. But the dying process is actually what many people have to talk about at death cafes. And the fear that comes up, the uncertainty, the not knowing, this is actually the difficult part. And we want to make sure that at death cafes, we allow for conversations about dying. You can even talk about illness and diagnosis, and then dying, and finally death.
And you spell it out very succinctly in your book.
Yes.
The whole dying process.
Yeah.
And I think that everybody should read that book.
Thank you. It certainly is my hope that everyone knows all the information in the book, because it is death education that every single one of us needs. We are all going to die one day. And probably before we die, we will watch other people die. And we need to learn what the death process is. And we need to know that the dying process is actually universal. I call this the Canadian Guide to End of Life, because the book is really a combination of the Canadian healthcare system and understanding how the healthcare system, like you have to know where to plug in.
Yes.
You have to know provincially what you can do and what you can't do, and what is paid for and what is not paid for. But then you also have to know what the body does. And so I'm told that the book it's very direct, it's very practical, and it's a little scary. It's scary because it is so straightforward. But there is some relief in actually hearing about things that nobody likes to talk about.
For anybody who is interested in the Death Cafe, how would they find out about it?
So generically, you go to deathcafe.com. And the website deathcafe.com is maintained by volunteers, including John Underwood's wife and mother. And they and a handful of other volunteers in England will post any death cafe around the world. There's now been about 20,000 death cafes in 90 different countries. It has grown tremendously, and it doesn't matter where you live. You go, there's an interactive website, and you can just pick and choose based on location and see where the closest death cafe to you is. You can read about different death cafes that have been held, but you can certainly just go on any night at midnight and check the website and see where the death cafes are and show up. You can also come to my personal website that always lists the death cafes that I run. My website is my name, if you can spell that. It's lindahochstetler.com, and I have a tab on my website for death cafes. On that site, there's a number of other articles. There's also podcasts about death cafes that you can read about, so you can get a little bit more of a flavor of what death cafes are all about on my personal website as well. And then lastly, the Toronto Public Library. You simply go onto their website And in the little search button, just like you were looking for a book or a film or something, you simply type in Deaf Cafe, and you'll find any upcoming Deaf Cafes that are being hosted in the city of Toronto. The Deaf Cafe movement is not supposed to be a somber kind of movement that makes you kind of get heavy and tight and fear death. But the Deaf Cafe movement is really all about connecting with other people who want to live life fully, vibrantly, with more openness, with more generosity, and really want to live fully. And that's the positive deaf movement that Deaf Cafes really fit into. It's part of this movement that says we can do deaf better. And collectively, we're going to actually urge society to begin facing death, creating options for making death less scary, making sure we don't die alone, and making sure that we are all talking about death in a way that is open and similar to how we talk about life or how we talk about birth. Imagine if we could talk about death as easily as we could talk about birth. We would have a changed society.
Thank you, Linda, for being so generous with your time today and for providing us with invaluable information on the Deaf Cafe.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing content every week. If you want to catch more of our adventures, check out the videos right here on our YouTube channel. And remember to leave a comment below. Let us know what you think or what you'd like to see next. We love hearing from you. Catch you in the next one.
On the next chapter of Aging in Place.
We're going to talk about your poetry book. Your first book is called A Life Well Traveled.
I marveled at the masses of stately tulips along the Cabot Trail, befriended the homeless dogs in remote Moosonee, sunbathed in Wasaga Beach.